Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Ordinary Days. Lawrence Murphy had always prided himself on reading people. 15 years in military intelligence, followed by another decade in corporate cybersecurity, had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. So when their new mailman started acting strange 3 weeks ago, Lawrence noticed immediately. The morning sun cast long shadows across their suburban Denver street as Lawrence watched from his home office window. Drew Lloyd, that's what the name tag read, approached their mailbox with the same hesitant gait he displayed every day since replacing old Pete, who'd retired after 30 years on the route. What bothered Lawrence wasn't just that Drew never used the mailbox. It was everything else. The way his eyes constantly scanned the neighborhood like he was expecting trouble, how he carried himself with military bearing despite the postal uniform, and most unnervingly, how he always seemed to time his deliveries for when Lawrence was visible through the window. "Coffee's getting cold," called Lynn Walton from the kitchen. Even after 12 years of marriage, her voice still made him smile. She kept her maiden name for her medical practice, Dr. Lynn Walton, pediatric surgeon at Denver Children's Hospital. "Just watching our mysterious mailman," Lawrence replied, grabbing his mug and joining her at the breakfast table. Lynn glanced out the window where Drew was now walking up their front path, mail in hand. "He seems nice enough. Maybe he's just thorough." Lawrence had met Drew properly only once, 2 weeks ago. The man was around 40, athletic build, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that never quite met his. When Lawrence had thanked him for hand-delivering everything, Drew had simply nodded and said, "Just making sure everything gets where it needs to go, sir." The formal "sir" had triggered something in Lawrence's memory. It was the way junior officers addressed their superiors, automatic and ingrained. Drew Lloyd was military, Lawrence was certain. But what was a soldier doing delivering mail in suburban Denver? The doorbell rang, and Lawrence opened it to find Drew holding a small package and their usual stack of letters. "Morning, Mr. Murphy. Package for you today." Drew's eyes did their usual sweep of the street behind Lawrence. "Thanks, Drew. Everything all right? You seem alert." For a moment, something flickered in Drew's expression. Surprise, maybe relief. "Just cautious by nature, sir. Old habits. Military." Drew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Marines. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Army intelligence myself. Iraq and Syria." Lawrence watched Drew's posture straighten slightly, the recognition of a fellow veteran. "Thank you for your service, sir." "Likewise." Lawrence accepted the mail, noting how Drew's hands were calloused in ways that suggested more recent combat training than a mail route would provide. "How long have you been with the Postal Service?" "Not long." Drew glanced at his watch. "I should keep moving. Have a good day, Mr. Murphy." As Drew walked away, Lawrence noticed he favored his left leg slightly, an old injury, but recent enough to still affect his gait. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. That evening, Lawrence found himself running background checks on his work computer. Drew Lloyd, 42, former Marine gunnery sergeant, decorated veteran of 3 combat deployments. Honorably discharged 8 months ago. No prior Postal Service employment on record. The official records showed Drew had joined the Postal Service 6 months ago, but Lawrence's deeper dive revealed something interesting. Drew's last known address was in Virginia, near Quantico. His Postal Service hiring had been expedited through a federal program for veterans, but the paperwork trail was oddly thin. "You're doing that thing again," Lynn said, appearing behind his chair with fresh coffee. "What thing?" "Your suspicious face. The same one you had when you figured out that software company was selling our client data to foreign governments." Lawrence leaned back, accepting the coffee. "Our mailman isn't what he seems. Honey, not everyone is a spy or a criminal. Maybe he's just a veteran trying to adjust to civilian life." Maybe, but Lawrence's instincts were rarely wrong. Drew Lloyd was operating undercover. The question was for whom and why. 2 hours later, Lawrence had his answer, or at least part of it. Using his security clearance and old intelligence contacts, he discovered that Drew Lloyd was currently listed as active duty, classified assignment, in military records, despite his apparent postal employment. Drew wasn't a mailman. He was an undercover operative working their neighborhood for reasons unknown. And tomorrow, Lawrence and Lynn were scheduled to fly to San Francisco for her medical conference. Chapter 2. The Warning. The next morning arrived with an unusual autumn chill. Lawrence was loading their luggage into the car when Drew appeared, right on schedule. But instead of approaching the house, he walked directly to Lawrence. "Mr. Murphy, I need to speak with you." Drew's voice was low, urgent. Privately, Lawrence straightened, his hand instinctively moving to where he used to carry his sidearm. "About what?" Drew glanced at the house, then at the car packed for travel. "You need to cancel your flight. Tomorrow." The words hit Lawrence like ice water. "What did you say?" "Tomorrow's flight to San Francisco. Don't get on that plane." "Who are you?" Lawrence stepped closer, studying Drew's face. The mailman facade was cracking, revealing something harder underneath. Drew looked around the street once more, then pulled back his left sleeve. What Lawrence saw made his blood freeze. A tattoo covered Drew's forearm. Not military ink, but something else entirely. It was a complex design incorporating a skull, wings, and the number 187. But more importantly, scarred into his skin just below the tattoo was a crude brand. "Traitor." "Jesus Christ," Lawrence whispered. He'd seen that brand before, in classified briefings about rogue military contractors who marked defectors. "You're not Postal Service. Federal Marshal, deep cover. I've been tracking a cell that's been eliminating witnesses. You're on their list." "What?" "That cybersecurity contract you finished last month. Meridian Defense Systems. You found something they didn't want found." Lawrence's mind raced. Meridian had hired his firm to audit their systems after a minor breach. He discovered some unusual file transfers, but had attributed them to poor security practices. The encrypted transfers to overseas accounts. Not accounts. Coordinates. Weapons drops. Meridian has been selling military hardware to insurgent groups, using their government contracts as cover. Your audit trail led back to their operation. I reported that to my client contact, Eugene Houston. The name hit Lawrence like a physical blow. Eugene Houston, his former Army intelligence colleague, now Meridian's head of security. They'd served together in Syria, had been close friends until Eugene's discharge for conduct unbecoming. Details classified, but Lawrence had heard rumors about unauthorized interrogations. "Eugene's involved? He's running it. And he knows you found the evidence. The plane tomorrow. It's not going to make it to San Francisco." Lawrence felt the world tilt. "My wife. She's not the target, but she's collateral now. They can't leave witnesses. Why should I trust you? For all I know, this is some elaborate setup." Drew pulled a phone from his pocket, showing Lawrence a video file. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago. The footage was grainy, clearly from a surveillance camera, but it showed Eugene Houston in conversation with two men Lawrence didn't recognize. The audio was poor, but he caught fragments. "Murphy knows too much. Plane crash more believable. Both of them, no survivors." That's from Eugene's office. "We've been monitoring him for 6 months, but we need more evidence to make charges stick. You're our best shot at getting him to incriminate himself. By using me as bait. By keeping you alive long enough to help us take him down. But first, we need to get you and your wife somewhere safe." Lawrence looked at their house, at the life he and Lynn had built together. "What do you need me to do?" "Cancel the flight, but don't let on that you know anything. Eugene will be watching for signs you're suspicious. We need him to think his plan is working. And then we set a trap of our own." Chapter 3. The Call. Lawrence stood in his driveway, phone in hand, watching Drew disappear around the corner. The federal marshal had given him specific instructions. Cancel the flight, but make it seem natural. Create a believable excuse that wouldn't trigger Eugene's suspicions. He dialed the airline first. "Yes, I need to cancel 2 tickets for tomorrow's flight to San Francisco. Flight 447. "Yes, I understand the penalty. My wife has a family emergency." The lie came easily, but Lawrence's hands were shaking. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already planning. 15 years of intelligence work had taught him that the best defense was often an unexpected offense. Next, He called Lynn at the hospital. Honey, we need to cancel San Francisco. No, not the conference itself, just our flights. I'll explain when you get home. Trust me, it's important. He could hear the confusion in her voice, but Lynn had learned to trust his instincts over the years. Okay, but Larry, you're scaring me. I know. Just be careful today. Don't leave the hospital until I pick you up. Lawrence Murphy, you tell me what's going on right now. When you get home, I promise. His final call was to Eugene Houston. The number was still in his contacts from their recent project meetings. Larry, good to hear from you. How's the San Francisco prep going? Eugene's voice was warm, friendly, the same tone he'd used during their service together. But now Lawrence heard something else underneath it, something calculated. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We had to cancel the trip. Lynn's father had a heart attack last night. We're driving to Kansas instead. A pause. Lawrence could almost hear Eugene's mind working. I'm sorry to hear that. Is he going to be okay? They think so, but you know how these things are. Family first. Of course. When do you think you'll be back? Probably a week, maybe 2. Depends on his recovery. Well, keep me posted. And Larry? Drive safe. The call ended, and Lawrence immediately dialed the number Drew had given him. It rang once before connecting. It's done, Lawrence said. Eugene bought it. Good. Are you somewhere secure? My house. 2 exposed. Pack essentials for you and your wife. 1 bag each. Meet me at the address I'm texting you in 2 hours. Lawrence looked at the text. An address in an industrial district 20 minutes away. What about my wife? She's at work until 6. I'll have someone pick her up. Dr. Walton will be told there's a family emergency and she needs to come immediately. She'll be brought to the safe house. What kind of someone? Federal agents. They'll identify themselves properly. After Drew hung up, Lawrence stood in his living room, looking at the photos on the mantel. Their wedding day, vacations, Lynn's medical school graduation. A life built on trust and honesty, now shattered by the discovery that his past was hunting his future. He packed quickly, clothes, documents, cash, and from his locked study drawer, the Sig Sauer P226 he'd carried overseas. If Eugene wanted to play soldier again, Lawrence would remind him who'd been the better strategist. An hour later, his phone rang. Eugene again. Larry, I just heard from a mutual friend that there was no heart attack in Kansas. Lynn's father is fine. Lawrence's blood chilled. Eugene had checked. Of course he had. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Eugene continued, but you've made a serious mistake. You should have just taken the flight. Eugene, you were always too curious for your own good. Remember Syria? How you couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. Lawrence did remember Syria. He remembered discovering that Eugene had been selling intelligence to local warlords, remembered the confrontation that led to Eugene's discharge. You're talking about yourself, not me. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, you're the one who's been digging where he shouldn't. The one who's been asking questions about things that don't concern him. Meridian Defense concerns me. What you're doing with those weapons shipments concerns me. Eugene laughed, but there was no humor in it. There it is. I wondered how long it would take you to connect the dots. You were always the smart one. It's over, Eugene. The feds are on to you. Are they? Because I'm looking at surveillance footage of you talking to that mailman this morning. Drew Lloyd, isn't it? Or should I say, Federal Marshal Drew Lloyd? Lawrence's heart sank. They'd been watched. Here's what's going to happen, Larry. You're going to come in from the cold. You and your lovely wife are going to disappear, just like you were supposed on that plane. The only difference is, now it's going to be messy, eh? You touch her and you'll what? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. I've got people watching the hospital. I've got people watching your house. And in about 30 minutes, I'm going to have people at that warehouse where you thought you were going to hide. The line went dead. Lawrence stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed his bag and ran for his car. Drew had said 2 hours, but Eugene had just made it clear they didn't have 2 hours. As he drove toward the warehouse district, Lawrence's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Dr. Walton is secure. Change of plans. New address following. The new address was across town in the opposite direction. Lawrence made a U-turn, hoping he wasn't driving into a trap, hoping Lynn was really safe, and hoping Drew Lloyd was as good at his job as he claimed to be. Because in 30 minutes, Eugene Houston and his people would discover that their targets had vanished. And then the real hunt would begin. Chapter 4. Safe House. The address led Lawrence to a seemingly abandoned auto repair shop in an industrial district. He sat in his car for 5 minutes, watching for movement, before a garage door opened and Drew Lloyd emerged, gesturing him inside. The interior had been transformed into a command center. Computer equipment lined makeshift tables, surveillance monitors showed feeds from around the city, and 3 other federal agents were coordinating what appeared to be a major operation. "Where's my wife?" Lawrence demanded before the garage door finished closing. "Safe room through that door." Drew pointed to a reinforced metal door at the back of the space. "Agent Pam Mays is with her." Lawrence pushed through the door to find Lynn pacing in a small but comfortable room, talking animatedly with a professional-looking woman in a dark suit. "Larry." Lynn rushed to him. "What the hell is going on?" "These people showed up at the hospital saying there was an emergency, then brought me here and started talking about federal protection." Lawrence held her tight, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "I'll explain everything." "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, just confused and angry." She pulled back to look at him. "The woman who picked me up said our house is being watched by dangerous people." Agent Mays stepped forward. "Mr. Murphy, I'm Agent Mays, FBI. We need to brief you both on the situation." They returned to the main room, where Drew had a laptop open, displaying satellite images of their neighborhood. "Eugene made his move faster than we anticipated," Drew explained. 20 minutes after your call, 3 vehicles with armed men surrounded your house. They're still there." Lawrence studied the images. He could make out figures positioned at strategic points around their property. Military tactics. Eugene's got a full crew of ex-special forces working for him, all dishonorably discharged, all with grudges against the system. Meridian Defense has been their legitimate front, but they've been running weapons to anyone willing to pay, including some very bad actors overseas. Agent Mays pulled up another screen showing financial records. Over the past 2 years, we estimate they've moved over $50 million in illegal arms sales. Your audit uncovered the digital trail that could finally nail them. "But why target us directly?" Lynn asked. "Why not just destroy the evidence?" "Because Lawrence didn't just find the evidence," Drew replied. "He inadvertently copied it. The audit report he submitted included encrypted files that he probably didn't realize were significant." Lawrence nodded slowly. "The anomalous data clusters. I flagged them as potential security breaches. Those clusters contain GPS coordinates, delivery schedules, and client lists for Eugene's operation. Everything we need to shut them down and arrest their buyers." "So where is this evidence now?" "That's the problem," Agent Mays admitted. "It's on your work server, encrypted with protocols that only you know. We need you to access it remotely." Lawrence looked around the room at the federal agents, at his wife's frightened face, at the surveillance feeds showing armed men surrounding their life. "And Eugene knows this?" "He figured out about an hour ago. That's why he's escalating. He needs to either get you to delete the files or eliminate you before we can access them." Drew pulled up a communication intercept on his screen. Eugene's voice was clear. "Find Murphy and bring him to the warehouse. Alive. He's the only one who can access those files. Once we have them deleted, we clean up the whole mess." "What warehouse?" Lawrence asked. "Meridian Defense has a facility on the outskirts of town. Officially, it's for equipment storage. Unofficially, it's where they've been staging their illegal shipments." Agent Mays leaned forward. "Here's what we're proposing. You help us access those files, and we'll use them to coordinate a simultaneous takedown of Eugene's entire network. But we need you to be bait." "Absolutely not," Lynn said immediately. "You're not using my husband as bait for a group of armed criminals. Dr. Walton, with respect, Eugene Houston isn't going to stop. He can't. Those files are evidence of treason, arms dealing, and conspiracy. He's looking at life in prison if we nail him. He'll keep coming until he eliminates the threat." Lawrence was already thinking ahead, his military training taking over. "What did you have in mind?" "Larry, no." Lynn gripped his arm. "Lynn, they're right. Eugene won't stop. And if I run, he'll just find another way to get to us." He turned to Drew. "But I'm not walking into his warehouse blind. If we're doing this, we do it my way. What are you thinking?" Lawrence studied the surveillance feeds, the tactical positions around his house, The desperation in Eugene's intercepted communications. His former colleague was good, but he was also emotional now. Emotional meant mistakes. Eugene's weakness was always his ego. He needs to feel like he's won, like he's the smartest person in the room. We can use that. Ow! We let him capture me, but not before I set my own trap. Lawrence turned to Agent Mays. How much do you trust your tech people? Chapter 5. The Setup. 3 hours later, Lawrence sat in the back of a black SUV, hands zip-tied behind his back, a bag over his head. To any observer, he was a captured man being transported to an uncertain fate. The reality was more complex. The capture had been choreographed. Lawrence had returned to his house, ostensibly to retrieve something important, walking directly into Eugene's surveillance net. The takedown had been quick, professional, and exactly what Drew's team had wanted Eugene to see. What Eugene didn't know was that Lawrence was wearing a nearly invisible wire, that his capture had been timed precisely, and that federal agents were tracking the SUV's every movement. More importantly, during the stage struggle at his house, Lawrence had managed to access his secure work terminal for exactly 47 seconds, long enough to execute a piece of code he'd been writing since his conversation with Drew. The SUV stopped, and Lawrence heard the sound of a large metal door opening. They were at the Meridian warehouse. "Bring him inside," a familiar voice commanded. Eugene. Lawrence was pulled from the vehicle and marched across concrete flooring. The bag was yanked from his head, and he found himself in a large warehouse space filled with military equipment crates. Eugene Houston stood before him, older and harder than Lawrence remembered, flanked by 4 armed men. "Hello, Larry. It's been too long." Eugene. "Still playing soldier, I see. Still playing the righteous intelligence officer, I see." Eugene nodded to one of his men, who cut Lawrence's zip ties. "Sit down. We need to talk." A chair was placed behind Lawrence. He sat, taking in the warehouse layout, counting exits, assessing threats. "Old habits. You know what I need from you?" Eugene continued. "The access codes to those files. Give them to me, and this ends quietly. And if I don't..." Eugene gestured around the warehouse. "Look around, Larry. Military-grade weapons, completely off the books. Some of these crates are headed to very unfriendly countries. Others are staying domestic, going to groups that the government pretends don't exist. You're talking about domestic terrorism. I'm talking about business. The government creates the demand for weapons by starting conflicts, then acts surprised when people want to buy them. I'm just cutting out the bureaucratic middleman." Lawrence kept his expression neutral, but internally he was cataloging everything Eugene said. The wire was recording all of it. "The thing is," Eugene continued, "you were always too idealistic. Even in Syria, you couldn't understand that sometimes the rules have to be bent to get results. Is that what you called selling tactical intelligence to insurgents? Bending rules?" Eugene's face darkened. "I was trying to end that war faster. A few strategic losses to make the politicians realize we needed to commit more resources or get out entirely. Those strategic losses included American soldiers, casualties of war. But you couldn't see the bigger picture, just like now." Lawrence shifted in his chair slightly, a signal to Drew's team that Eugene was admitting to treason. "What bigger picture, Eugene? Getting rich while people die. Building something that lasts. The government is failing, Larry. Look around. Endless wars, corrupt politicians, an economy propped up by debt. When it all comes down, people like us need to be ready." "People like us?" "Military leaders who understand how the world really works. We're not criminals, we're revolutionaries." One of Eugene's men approached and whispered something in his ear. Eugene nodded and turned back to Lawrence. "My people tell me you accessed your work terminal during the struggle at your house. 47 seconds. Enough time to do something, but what?" Lawrence had been waiting for this question. "I deleted the files." "Bullshit. Check for yourself. I'm not going to prison because you couldn't keep your operation quiet." Eugene pulled out a tablet and began typing. Lawrence watched his face change as he accessed the Meridian systems. "The files are still there, Larry, but they're corrupted now. Unreadable." "Oops." Eugene backhanded Lawrence across the face, the force of it snapping his head sideways. "You think this is funny? Do you have any idea what you just done?" I've stopped you from deleting evidence of your crimes. Those files aren't just evidence against me. They contain client lists, financial records, shipping manifests. You've just signed death warrants for dozens of federal agents working undercover in terrorist organizations. Lawrence felt ice in his veins. What are you talking about? You think all those weapons shipments were illegal? Some of them were authorized, Larry. Black Ops, need-to-know operations to put weapons in the hands of assets who are gathering intelligence on real threats. The files you corrupted contain operational details that could expose them. You're lying. Am I? Check with your federal friends. Ask them how many deep-cover operations have been compromised in the last few hours. Eugene turned to one of his men. Start the van. We're moving to the secondary location. What secondary location? Somewhere your wire won't be monitored by federal agents. Lawrence's blood chilled. What wire? Eugene smiled. Larry, I've known you're wearing a wire since you walked in here. You think I'm stupid? Everything I've said here has been carefully calculated. The question is, how much did you tell your new friends about our history together? Chapter 6, Revelations. Eugene's revelation hit Lawrence like a physical blow. The entire conversation had been theater performed for the federal agents listening in. But what did that mean for their operation? You seem confused, Larry. Let me clarify. Eugene gestured to his men, who began moving crates toward the warehouse exits. The files you thought you were protecting? They're not what you think they are. Then tell me what they are. A honeypot. Bait to draw out federal agents who've been tracking our legitimate operations for months. The real question is, how did they recruit you so quickly? What did they tell you to make you believe I was the villain? Lawrence's mind raced. They showed me surveillance footage of you planning to kill me and my wife. Deepfake technology is remarkable these days, isn't it? Especially when it's created by federal agencies with unlimited budgets. You're lying. Am I? Tell me, Larry, what do you actually know about Drew Lloyd? Did you verify his identity independently? Or did you just take his word that he was a federal marshal? The question struck home because Lawrence realized he hadn't verified anything. He'd been operating on instinct and trust, the same way he'd operated overseas. But overseas, he'd had extensive intelligence networks to verify information. Drew showed me his credentials, which can be faked. He showed you surveillance footage, which can be fabricated. He told you I was planning to kill you, but did he explain why I would risk everything to eliminate one cybersecurity contractor? Lawrence hesitated. The truth was, the motivation had never quite made sense. Why would Eugene risk exposure by directly targeting Lawrence when there were less risky ways to handle the situation? Because I found evidence of your arms dealing. No, Larry. Because you found evidence of a federal arms dealing operation, and someone needed a scapegoat to take the fall when it inevitably came to light. Eugene pulled out a phone and showed Lawrence a series of documents. These are the real shipping manifests. Look at the authorization codes. Lawrence studied the screen. The codes were federal, and they matched patterns he recognized from his intelligence days. These weren't black market sales. These were authorized government transfers. The federal government has been arming various groups for years, Eugene continued. Some friendly, some not so friendly, all deniable. When Congress started asking too many questions about missing weapons, someone needed to take the blame. And that someone is you? That someone was supposed to be me. But I got smart and started keeping records. Insurance, you might say. That's what your audit really uncovered. Evidence that could embarrass some very powerful people in Washington. Lawrence's head was spinning. So what's the real play here? The people who recruited you aren't federal agents, Larry. They're private contractors working for the same government officials who authorized those weapons transfers. Their job is to eliminate the evidence and anyone who's seen it, including me, including you. But here's the thing. I don't want to see an old friend get used as a patsy. That's why I've been trying to get you somewhere safe where we can talk. One of Eugene's men approached. Sir, we've got movement outside. Multiple vehicles, federal plates. Eugene cursed. They're moving faster than I expected. He turned to Lawrence. Decision time, my friend. You can go with them and end up dead in a staged criminal shootout, or you can trust me and let me show you the truth. What truth? That Drew Lloyd and his team aren't who they say they are. that the safe house where they took your wife isn't a federal facility, and that in about 10 minutes, this warehouse is going to be hit by a tactical team whose orders are to leave no witnesses. Lawrence looked toward the warehouse entrance, where he could now hear the sound of vehicles approaching. Prove it. Eugene tossed him a radio. Channel 7. Listen. Lawrence tuned the radio and immediately heard tactical chatter. Phoenix team in position. All targets to be neutralized. No survivors per Directive 77 Alpha. The words chilled Lawrence's blood. Directive 77 Alpha was military code for killing everyone at a target location, including civilians. Your wife is in a building that's about to be raided by the same team, Eugene said quietly. They'll claim she was killed in the crossfire when my criminals opened fire on federal agents. No. Lawrence grabbed Eugene's arm. Where is she? The auto shop where they took you. It's not a federal safe house, Larry. It's a kill box. Lawrence stared at Eugene, tried to read his face, trying to determine if this was another layer of deception. But the radio chatter was continuing, and it was detailed, specific, and terrifying. What do you want from me? Help me get to your wife before they execute their final phase. Then I'll show you who's really pulling the strings. And if you're lying, then we'll both be dead in the next hour, and your wife will be shortly after. Outside, the vehicles had stopped. Lawrence could hear doors slamming, orders being shouted. The tactical team was preparing to breach the warehouse. Back exit, Eugene said, moving toward the rear of the building. My people have a route mapped out, but we need to move now. Lawrence looked at the radio in his hand, still crackling with tactical chatter about eliminating all witnesses. He looked at Eugene, his former colleague and potential enemy. He thought about Lynn, somewhere in the city, possibly in mortal danger. Let's go. Chapter 7, The Counterstrike. Lawrence followed Eugene through a maze of back alleys and industrial corridors, moving fast but staying low. Eugene's team of 4 moved with military precision, their knowledge of the area suggesting extensive advance planning. How long have you known this was coming? Lawrence asked as they paused behind a storage facility. 3 months. I started noticing federal interest in our operations, but the pattern was wrong. Too aggressive, too focused on elimination rather than arrests. Real federal agents would want to flip our operation, use it to track larger networks. These people just wanted us gone. So who are they? Private military contractors working for a coalition of government officials who authorized those weapons transfers I mentioned. When the transfers started drawing congressional attention, they needed scapegoats. Eugene's radio crackled. Package is secure. Moving to extraction point. What package? Your wife. My people intercepted the team that was supposed to kill her. Lawrence grabbed Eugene's arm. She's alive. For now. But they'll keep trying until they clean up this mess permanently. They moved through an abandoned factory complex, Eugene's team maintaining security while he and Lawrence talked. I need proof, Lawrence said. Real proof, not more documents that could be faked. Eugene stopped and pulled out a secure phone. I'm going to make a call. You're going to listen to the whole thing. He dialed and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a voice answered. Eugene, what's your status? We have a problem, Senator. Murphy's not cooperating. Lawrence recognized the voice, Senator Frank Nicholson, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Then eliminate the problem, Nicholson replied. We can't have this exposure now, not with the elections coming up. Understood. What about the wife? Collateral damage. Make it look like a criminal operation that went wrong. The public will buy it. Eugene ended the call and looked at Lawrence. Senator Nicholson authorized those weapons transfers to insurgent groups in Syria. When they started using them against American forces, he needed someone to blame. And you're that someone. I was supposed to be. But I kept records, and I reached out to some old contacts who confirmed what I suspected. There's a whole network of officials using private contractors to handle their dirty work. Lawrence's mind was processing rapidly. The files I found, they weren't evidence of your crimes. They were evidence of theirs. Exactly. And when you stumbled onto them, they needed to eliminate both the evidence and the witnesses. Eugene's radio crackled again. Alpha team to base. Warehouse is empty. Targets have escaped. How much time do we have? Lawrence asked. Not much. They'll be tracking us through city cameras, satellite surveillance, the works. Eugene checked his watch. But I've got one advantage they don't know about, which is I've been preparing for this for months. Safe houses, escape routes, and evidence caches they can't access or destroy. They reached a nondescript office building where Eugene led them to a service elevator. The basement level had been converted into a command center that rivaled anything Lawrence had seen in his military days. "Welcome to my insurance policy," Eugene said. The space contained servers, communication equipment, and multiple screens showing surveillance feeds from around the city. But what caught Lawrence's attention were the evidence boards covering one wall, photographs, documents, recorded conversations, and detailed timelines connecting Senator Nicholson to a dozen other officials. "Jesus, Eugene, how long have you been building this?" "2 years. Ever since I realized what they were really having me do." Eugene activated one of the screens, showing a map of the city with multiple red dots. Each of these locations contains evidence that could bring down the entire network. What kind of evidence? Recording devices in their offices, copies of their communications, financial records showing payments to private contractors, even video surveillance of meetings where they planned operations like this one. Lawrence studied the evidence board. This is enough to destroy them. It's enough to send them all to federal prison for the rest of their lives, which is why they're so desperate to stop us. One of Eugene's men approached. "Sir, we've got activity at all our backup locations. They're hitting everything simultaneously." "Expected," Eugene replied. "But they don't know about the dead man's switch." "What dead man's switch?" Eugene turned to Lawrence with a grim smile. "If I don't check in every 12 hours, all of this evidence gets automatically uploaded to every major news outlet, congressional oversight committee, and international law enforcement agency simultaneously." "And your next check-in?" 3 hours ago." Lawrence stared at him. "You mean?" "The upload already started. Everything they've done, everyone they've killed to cover this up, it's all going public in about 6 hours. Eugene's radio crackled with frantic chatter from the tactical teams. They were realizing their operation was falling apart. "So what happens now?" Lawrence asked. "Now we stay alive long enough for the evidence to go public and for the real federal agents to take over. But first, we need to get your wife back." "Where is she?" Eugene activated another screen, showing surveillance footage of a warehouse across town. Lawrence could see Lynn in what appeared to be a holding cell, alive but clearly frightened. "They're using her as bait to draw us out. But they don't know we've been watching them watching us." "What's the plan?" Eugene began pulling weapons and tactical gear from storage lockers. "We go in hard, we get her out, and we hold position until the cavalry arrives." "What cavalry?" "The real federal agents. The ones who've been investigating Senator Nicholson and his network independently. They'll move the moment my evidence goes public." Lawrence accepted a pistol and tactical vest from Eugene. "How do I know you're not just using me?" "Because, Larry, in about 5 hours, the truth is going to come out whether you help me or not. The only question is whether your wife survives long enough to see it." Chapter 8. The Rescue. The warehouse where they were holding Lynn sat in an industrial district, surrounded by open ground that offered excellent fields of fire, but limited cover for an assault team. Eugene's reconnaissance had identified 12 hostiles, professional operators with military-grade equipment. "They're expecting us to come in emotional and sloppy," Eugene explained as they studied the building from a neighboring rooftop. "Former Army intelligence versus private contractors. They think they know how we'll move. But they don't know you've been planning this for months." "Exactly." Eugene pointed to specific locations around the warehouse. "I've had surveillance on this facility for weeks. I know their patrol patterns, their communication protocols, their backup plans." Lawrence studied the building through binoculars. "They've got her in the northeast corner, 2nd floor. Good sight lines on all approaches. Unless you're not approaching from ground level." Eugene showed Lawrence a tablet with building schematics. "This whole district connects underground through old maintenance tunnels. We can get within 50 feet of the building without being seen." "What about extraction?" "Helicopter pickup from the roof, but only after we've secured the target." Lawrence checked his weapon and radio. "How many people do you have?" 4 plus us." against 12 entrenched defenders with hostage protection protocols. Bad odds, only if we play by their rules. Eugene led the team through a maintenance access point that connected to the underground tunnel system. The tunnels were old but well-maintained, clearly part of Eugene's extensive preparation for this scenario. As they moved through the darkness, Eugene's radio provided updates from his surveillance team. Target is mobile, northeast corner, 2 guards, patrol rotation every 15 minutes. No external backup visible. They reached a position directly beneath the warehouse. Eugene opened a floor access panel that led to the building's basement level. From here, we split up, Eugene whispered. Team Alpha takes the ground floor and draws their attention. Team Beta gets to the second floor and secures the hostage. I'll coordinate from the building's communications center. Where do you want me? Lawrence asked. With me. You're the only one she'll trust in a crisis situation. They moved up through the building systematically. Eugene's team was professional, efficient, and deadly quiet. Within minutes, they had disabled the building's security systems and taken positions throughout the first floor. Lawrence followed Eugene up a service stairway toward the second floor. Through his radio, he could hear the soft chatter of the assault team taking their positions. Movement, second floor, northeast corridor, came a whisper from Team Beta. Lawrence clicked his radio twice in acknowledgement. They were close. Eugene held up a hand, pointing around the corner. 2 guards stood outside a reinforced door, alert but not expecting an attack from inside the building. On my mark, Eugene whispered into his radio. All teams, execute. The coordinated assault was swift and precise. Eugene's team had trained for this exact scenario, and they moved with the efficiency of professionals who had worked together for years. Lawrence heard the sound of flashbangs going off on the first floor, drawing the attention of most of the guards. The 2 men outside Lynn's door ran toward the stairwell, leaving the corridor momentarily clear. Eugene and Lawrence moved fast. The door was electronically locked, but Eugene produced a bypass device that had it open in seconds. Lynn was inside, zip-tied to a chair but unharmed. Her eyes widened when she saw Lawrence. Larry, how did you? Later, Lawrence said, cutting her restraints. We need to move. Eugene was monitoring his radio. Ground floor secure. 12 hostiles neutralized or detained. Extraction route clear. Extraction route? Lynn asked as they helped her to her feet. Helicopter on the roof, Lawrence explained. Eugene's got this whole thing planned out. They moved toward the building's roof access, Eugene's team providing security. But as they reached the stairwell, Eugene's radio crackled with urgent chatter. Multiple vehicles approaching, federal plates. Armed tactical teams. This isn't our extraction. Eugene cursed. They're still trying to clean up the mess. Even with the evidence about to go public, they want to eliminate us before it hits. How long until your evidence uploads? Lawrence asked. Eugene checked his watch. 2 hours. Too long. They'll kill us and claim we were criminals who took hostages. They reached the roof access door. Outside, Lawrence could hear helicopters approaching, but also the sound of vehicles surrounding the building. Options? Lawrence asked. Eugene activated a secure communication device. There is one. I've got a contact in the real FBI who's been monitoring the situation. If I can get through to her, she might be able to stop the cleanup teams. She's been gathering evidence on the same network we've been tracking. If she knows the full scope of what's happening, she might be able to invoke federal authority and shut down the contractor teams. Eugene began dialing, but before the call could connect, the roof access door exploded inward. For tactical team members poured through, weapons raised. Federal agents. Down on the ground, Lawrence knew these weren't federal agents. Their equipment was wrong, their procedures were wrong, and their intent was clearly lethal rather than arrestive. Eugene apparently reached the same conclusion. Run. The rooftop battle was brief but intense. Eugene's team had the advantage of knowing the building layout, but the attacking force had superior numbers and equipment. Lawrence grabbed Lynn and pulled her toward the far side of the roof, where a fire escape led to an adjacent building. Behind them, gunfire erupted as Eugene's team engaged the attackers. Larry, what's happening? Lynn gasped as they climbed down the fire escape. Eugene was telling the truth. The people who said they were protecting us are actually trying to kill us. They reached the adjacent building's roof just as Eugene joined them, his radio crackling with updates from his surviving team members. Two down, rest or mobile, came a voice through static. Recommend immediate extraction. Eugene looked at Lawrence and Lynn. The helicopter pickup is compromised. We need another way out. What about your FBI contact? Eugene held up his secure phone. Still trying to get through. But even if I do, it'll take time for her to mobilize real federal support. Below them, tactical teams were moving through the industrial district, clearly conducting a systematic search. How much time? Lawrence asked. Eugene checked his watch again. 90 minutes until the evidence upload. If we can stay alive that long, this whole network gets exposed. Lawrence looked at his wife, frightened but determined. Then at Eugene, a man he'd once considered an enemy, but who had risked everything to save them. Then we hold out for 90 minutes. Chapter 9. The Truth Emerges. The abandoned factory where they took refuge had been part of Eugene's contingency planning. The building was equipped with surveillance equipment, secure communications, and defensive positions that could be held by a small team against a larger force. 45 minutes, Eugene announced, monitoring multiple screens showing tactical teams positioning around their location. But they're not just trying to kill us anymore. They're trying to stop the upload. How can they do that? Cyber attack on the servers hosting my evidence. If they can crash the systems before the upload completes, they buy themselves time to destroy the physical evidence. Lawrence studied the surveillance feeds. How many people do they have out there? 30, maybe 40. Professional contractors with federal-level equipment and authorization to use lethal force. Lynn was monitoring a police scanner Eugene had provided. I'm hearing reports of a terrorist incident in this district. They're establishing a perimeter to keep legitimate law enforcement out. Standard protocol for black ops cleanup, Eugene confirmed. Create a plausible cover story, control the scene, eliminate witnesses, then brief the media on how federal agents heroically stopped a terrorist cell. Eugene's secure phone finally connected. He put it on speaker as he continued monitoring the surveillance feeds. Agent Russell? This is Eugene Houston. Yes, I know you've been looking for me. No, listen to me. The operation you think you're investigating? It's bigger than you know. Lawrence could hear a woman's voice responding. Mr. Houston, you're wanted for questioning in connection with illegal arms sales. Agent Russell, in 30 minutes, evidence is going to be uploaded automatically that will prove I was working for Senator Nicholson and others to conduct authorized weapons transfers. The people trying to kill me right now are private contractors hired to eliminate that evidence. A pause. What evidence? Recording devices in Nicholson's office, financial records of payments to Black Ridge Security, documentation of weapons transfers to groups that later attacked American forces. Everything. That would be treason. It is treason. And right now, Black Ridge contractors are surrounding my position with orders to eliminate me, my evidence, and 2 innocent civilians before the upload completes. Lawrence could hear Agent Russell typing in the background. I'm looking at federal deployment authorizations for your location. This shows standard counterterrorism operations against an armed group. Those authorizations are fraudulent. Check the signature authorities against actual federal databases. I'll bet they don't match. More typing. A long pause. Jesus, these authorizations are forged. The signature codes don't exist in federal systems. Because they're not federal agents, Agent Russell. They're private contractors using false federal credentials to conduct unauthorized operations on American soil. I need verification of what you're telling me. Eugene checked his watch. 28 minutes. Check your secure email. I'm sending you a sample of the evidence that's about to be uploaded. Eugene typed rapidly, sending files to Agent Russell's federal email address. Lawrence watched the surveillance feeds as the contractors tightened their perimeter around the factory. My God, Agent Russell's voice came through the phone after several minutes. This implicates dozens of officials. Senators, Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and they're willing to commit murder on American soil to cover it up, Eugene replied. I need federal backup, real federal backup, right now. I'm mobilizing teams, but it'll take time to get authorization for an operation this size. We don't have time. In 25 minutes, either the evidence goes public or we're all dead. Lawrence had been studying the tactical displays. Eugene, they're not just surrounding us. They're preparing to level this building. On the surveillance feeds, contractors were positioning what appeared to be demolition charges around the factory's support structures. Agent Russell, are you monitoring this location with federal surveillance? Yes, why? Because you're about to witness the murder of 3 American civilians by private contractors using forged federal credentials. Eugene activated external cameras that showed the contractors placing explosive charges. They're going to bring down the building and claim we were terrorists who died when their bomb-making operation exploded. I'm dispatching immediate federal response, Agent Russell said. Hold your position. Not much choice, Lawrence replied, checking his weapon. Eugene, what happens if they destroy the building before the upload completes? Backup systems. The evidence is stored in multiple locations with redundant upload protocols. But if they can disrupt enough systems simultaneously, they might delay it long enough to destroy the physical evidence. Lynn was monitoring radio communications. They're coordinating with someone called Command Authority for final authorization to detonate. Eugene activated another communication device. That'll be Senator Nicholson. He's probably watching this whole thing remotely, waiting to give the order to eliminate us. Can you record that order? Already am. Every communication they've made has been captured. When this goes public, it'll show a sitting United States senator ordering the execution of American civilians. Lawrence's radio crackled with incoming federal communications. This is FBI Tactical Team 7, approaching your location. Identify yourselves. Eugene responded. Eugene Houston, Lawrence Murphy, and Dr. Lynn Walton. Civilians under attack by private contractors using false federal credentials. Copy that. We have visual on multiple armed subjects around your building who are not federal personnel. Stand by. Through the surveillance feeds, Lawrence watched as genuine federal agents surrounded the contractors. The difference was immediately apparent. Proper federal procedures, correct equipment, legitimate authorization codes. Private contractors, this is the FBI. You're ordered to stand down immediately. Drop your weapons and identify yourselves. Eugene checked his watch. 15 minutes. We're going to make it. But their celebration was premature. The contractors, realizing their operation was compromised, began fighting both the federal agents and preparing to detonate their charges simultaneously. They're going to blow the building anyway, Lawrence realized, even if it means killing federal agents. Eugene was already moving toward an emergency exit he'd prepared. Tunnel system. We can get clear of the blast radius. They ran through the factory toward a concealed passage that led to the underground maintenance tunnels. Behind them, gunfire erupted as federal agents engaged the contractors. As they reached the tunnel entrance, Eugene's radio crackled with a new voice. This is Senator Nicholson. Authorization is granted for immediate demolition. Eliminate all evidence. Did you get that? Lawrence asked. Eugene held up his recording device. Every word. A sitting senator just ordered the murder of federal agents. They descended into the tunnel system as the building above them erupted in coordinated explosions. The contractors had detonated their charges, bringing down the factory and eliminating any physical evidence it might have contained. But as they emerged from a tunnel exit 3 blocks away, Eugene's phone chimed with a notification. Upload complete. Evidence successfully transmitted to all designated recipients. Agent Russell's voice came through the radio. Houston, this is Agent Russell. I'm reading successful evidence uploads to multiple federal agencies, congressional oversight committees, and news organizations. It's over. Lawrence looked at Eugene, then at his wife, then at the burning remains of the factory in the distance. Is it really over? Eugene was monitoring news feeds on his phone. Senator Nicholson has been arrested. Black Ridge Securities assets have been frozen, and federal agents are executing search warrants on 24 officials connected to the weapons transfer operation. What about us? We're witnesses now. Federal protection, congressional testimony, and probably book deals if we want them. Lynn grabbed Lawrence's hand. Can we go home now? Lawrence looked at the burning factory, at the federal agents securing the scene, at Eugene Houston, a man he'd misjudged completely. Yeah, he said, we can go home. 6 months later, Lawrence testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee about the conspiracy that had nearly cost their lives. Senator Nicholson and 12 other officials were convicted of treason, arms dealing, and conspiracy to commit murder. The private contractors who had tried to kill them received life sentences. Eugene Houston was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony and cooperation. He disappeared after the trials, but Lawrence occasionally received postcards from exotic locations around the world. Drew Lloyd, the real Drew Lloyd, turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed, a federal marshal working undercover. The people who had posed as federal agents and targeted Lawrence's family were all private contractors working for Black Ridge Security. Lawrence and Lynn sold their house in Denver and moved to a small town in Montana, where Lawrence opened a cybersecurity consulting firm and Lynn established a rural medical practice. They lived quietly, securely, and happily. But Lawrence kept his old military training sharp, and he never forgot the lesson Eugene Houston had taught him. Sometimes the people claiming to protect you are the ones you need protection from. And sometimes the enemy of your enemy really is your friend. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Mechanic's Mask. Kenneth Bauer wiped the grease from his hands with a red shop rag, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal filings filling his nostrils. Bauer's Auto Repair sat on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Colorado, a deliberately chosen location that kept him away from the prying eyes of suburbia. To his customers, he was just another small-town mechanic who could fix anything with wheels. They had no idea that the man replacing their brake pads had once led covert operations in the mountains of Afghanistan. The bell above the shop door chimed as Angela Hansenbauer walked in, her designer heels clicking against the concrete floor. Even after 8 years of marriage, she still carried herself like the real estate agent she was, polished, professional, and increasingly distant. Kenneth noticed how she avoided looking directly at the greasy coveralls he wore, as if his honest work somehow diminished her. Kenneth, I'm showing a property to a client tonight. I'll be home late. Her voice carried that practiced tone she used with difficult sellers. Don't wait up. He nodded, watching her reflection in the chrome bumper of the Mustang he was working on. Angela had been showing properties a lot lately, always to mysterious clients who seemed to require evening appointments. Kenneth's trained eye caught the subtle tells, the way she touched her neck when lying, the slight pause before delivering rehearsed lines, the new perfume that wasn't the one he'd bought her for their anniversary. Who's the client? Kenneth asked casually, not looking up from the engine. Stephen Hathaway. He's looking for commercial space downtown. The name rolled off her tongue too easily, like she practiced saying it. Kenneth filed the name away in the mental catalog that had kept him alive through 3 tours overseas. Stephen Hathaway. He made a note to remember it. After Angela left, Kenneth locked up the shop and walked to his truck. The transition from mechanic to hunter was seamless, a skill he'd honed in places where the wrong move meant death. Tonight, he would begin surveillance. The restaurant where Angela claimed to be meeting her client was a small Italian place called Marcelli's, known for intimate lighting and secluded booths. Kenneth positioned himself across the street in his truck, using the same patience that had made him an exceptional sniper. He didn't have to wait long. Angela arrived first, but she wasn't dressed for a business meeting. The black dress she wore was one Kenneth had never seen, cut low and hugging curves she'd been hiding under conservative real estate attire. 20 minutes later, a man arrived, tall, dark-haired, wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate money. Stephen Hathaway, no doubt. Kenneth watched through military-grade binoculars as the man kissed his wife. Not a greeting between business associates, but the lingering kiss of lovers who'd been apart too long. Angela's hand found the man's chest, her fingers tracing patterns that Kenneth recognized as intimate gestures she'd once reserved for him. The betrayal should have hurt. Instead, Kenneth felt the cold calculation that had made him deadly in combat. His wife had chosen to play a dangerous game, and she had no idea she was playing against someone who'd perfected the art of war. Kenneth started the truck and drove home to their suburban house on Maple Street. The white picket fence and manicured lawn were Angela's choices, part of the respectable life she'd wanted after his discharge. Inside, he went to the basement workshop where he kept his hobby equipment, tools that had nothing to do with automotive repair. Hidden behind a false wall were items from his military days, surveillance equipment, tactical gear, weapons that weren't registered anywhere. Kenneth had never truly left the battlefield. He'd simply changed theaters of operation. He powered up the computer system he'd built for security research and began running background checks on Stephen Hathaway. The man's digital footprint revealed interesting details. Divorce attorney specializing in high-asset cases, multiple properties, a history of relationships with married women. Angela wasn't his first conquest, just his latest. As Kenneth compiled his intelligence, a plan began forming. He'd learned in the service that the best operations were those where the enemy eliminated themselves through their own choices. Angela and Stephen thought they were playing a simple game of adultery. Kenneth would show them what real strategy looked like. The basement workshop had another secret, a hidden room behind the water heater where Kenneth kept his most sensitive equipment. Tonight, he retrieved audio surveillance devices, micro cameras, and GPS trackers that would turn his own home into an intelligence gathering station. By dawn, Kenneth had planted monitoring devices throughout the house, focusing on Angela's private spaces. Her home office, their bedroom, even her car would now report to him. The mechanic's mask would remain in place, but underneath, the commander was taking control of the battlefield. Kenneth made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at the peaceful suburban morning. Neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes to school, the postman making his rounds. None of them knew that a war had just begun, and that by the time it ended, some people who were breathing this morning would no longer be drawing breath. Angela came home at 2 a.m., slipping into bed with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to deception. Kenneth pretended to sleep, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm of someone whose conscience carried no burden. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. Chapter 2. Patterns of Deception. 3 weeks of surveillance revealed the intricate web Angela and Stephen had woven. Kenneth discovered their pattern. Tuesday and Thursday client meetings, weekend property viewings, and late-night phone calls Angela thought she was having in private. The audio devices captured everything. Intimate conversations, future plans, and most importantly, their growing carelessness. Kenneth maintained his routine at the shop, but his real work happened after hours. Using skills learned in military intelligence, he mapped their relationship timeline, identified their meeting locations, and documented their communications. What he discovered went far beyond simple adultery. Stephen Hathaway wasn't just Angela's lover. He was her financial advisor in a scheme to drain Kenneth's assets. The auto shop, their house, Kenneth's military pension, even his disability compensation were all targets in their long-term plan. They intended to force a divorce where Angela would claim emotional abuse, taking half of everything while maintaining the sympathy of the community. The recordings from Angela's home office revealed the depth of their planning. "He's too trusting," Angela had said during one late-night call. "Kenneth thinks I'm this innocent real estate agent. He has no idea how much I've learned about hiding assets." Stephen's response chilled Kenneth to the bone. "Once we're married, we'll relocate to Costa Rica. No extradition, and your husband's military honor will prevent him from coming after us." Men like him follow rules. They were right about one thing. Kenneth followed rules. Military rules. Rules of engagement that applied when dealing with enemy combatants who threatened everything he'd built. Kenneth's investigation expanded to include Stephen's law practice. Using social engineering techniques, he posed as a potential client and gathered intelligence on Stephen's operation. The man was running a sophisticated marriage destruction business, identifying wealthy spouses, seducing their partners, then manipulating divorce proceedings to maximize their take. Angela wasn't Stephen's first victim, and she wouldn't be his last. Kenneth found evidence of at least 4 previous cases where Stephen had orchestrated similar schemes. 2 of those previous victims had died under suspicious circumstances after the divorces were finalized, apparent suicides that removed loose ends and freed up money for Stephen and his accomplices. The pattern was clear: seduce, steal, eliminate. Angela thought she was Stephen's partner, but Kenneth recognized her true role. She was another mark, useful for accessing Kenneth's assets, but ultimately disposable once Stephen had what he needed. Kenneth's training had taught him to always gather intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. What he discovered about Stephen's resources was troubling. The man had connections to professional criminals, cleaners who specialized in making problems disappear. Kenneth found encrypted communications referencing the Pine Ridge problem and payments to individuals with military-style call signs. It became clear that Stephen and Angela weren't just planning to steal from Kenneth. They were planning to eliminate him entirely. The suicides of Stephen's previous marks hadn't been suicides at all. They'd been executions disguised as mental health crises. Kenneth's basement workshop became a war room. Maps of the area, photographs of all involved parties, communication intercepts, and tactical assessments covered every surface. He was no longer just dealing with infidelity. He was facing a conspiracy that threatened his life. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Kenneth had followed Angela to what he thought was another rendezvous with Stephen, but instead of meeting at their usual locations, she drove to a warehouse district outside town. Hidden in the shadows, Kenneth watched as Angela met not just with Stephen, but with 4 other men. Through his scope, Kenneth recognized the type immediately. Military contractors, the kind of men who sold their skills to the highest bidder. They moved with the disciplined precision of former special forces, and their discussion with Angela and Stephen was clearly operational in nature. Kenneth couldn't hear the conversation from his position, but he could read body language and tactical positioning. This was a planning session for an operation. Maps were spread on a table, photographs were passed around, and money changed hands. One of the contractors held up a photo that Kenneth recognized. It was his house on Maple Street. The reality hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to frame him or steal from him. They were planning to have him killed. Angela would play the grieving widow, inheriting everything legally. Stephen would console her through her loss, and together they'd disappear with Kenneth's life's work. Kenneth's phone vibrated with a text message from Angela. Working late again. Client emergency. Love you. The casual lie, sent while she stood 50 yards away planning his murder, crystallized something cold and final in Kenneth's chest. This wasn't just betrayal, it was warfare. And in war, Kenneth played by different rules than the ones Stephen assumed he'd follow. Kenneth made his decision in that warehouse parking lot. He wouldn't wait for them to act. He wouldn't try to reason with them or appeal to whatever humanity Angela might have left. He would do what he'd been trained to do: neutralize the threat with extreme prejudice. The drive home was spent in tactical planning mode. Kenneth mentally cataloged his resources, considered various scenarios, and began formulating a strategy that would eliminate all threats while maintaining his operational security. By the time he pulled into his garage, the plan was taking shape. Angela came home at midnight, slipping into bed with her usual stealth. Kenneth lay in the darkness, listening to her breathe, knowing that tomorrow he would begin the kind of operation that had made him legendary in certain military circles. But this time, the battlefield was his own home, and the enemy had already made the fatal mistake of underestimating him. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Preparation. Kenneth's transformation from betrayed husband to tactical operative happened gradually over the following weeks. He maintained his cover as the trusting mechanic while systematically preparing for war. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required meticulous planning, and this mission would be no different. The first phase involved intelligence gathering on the contractors Angela and Stephen had hired. Using skills he developed in counterterrorism, Kenneth identified each man through facial recognition software and cross-referenced their identities with databases he still had access to through military contacts. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The team consisted of former Delta Force operatives who'd gone private after questionable discharges. Their leader was a man named Gordon Pierce, known in certain circles as the Cleaner. Pierce specialized in assassination disguised as home invasions, random violence that left no trail back to whoever paid for the hit. Kenneth's surveillance revealed their method of operation. Surveillance the target's routine, identify the optimal time for attack, breach the home during vulnerable hours, eliminate the target, and stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Simple, effective, and virtually untraceable when executed properly. What Pierce and his team didn't know was that they were planning to attack someone who'd spent years hunting men exactly like them in much more dangerous environments. Kenneth began turning his suburban home into a tactical maze designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. The modifications were subtle but lethal. Reinforced entry points that would force intruders to use specific routes. Strategically placed mirrors that gave Kenneth sight lines throughout the house. Weapons caches hidden in seemingly innocent locations, and emergency escape routes built into the basement workshop. To any casual observer, it looked like standard home security improvements. To someone with Kenneth's background, it was a fortress designed for close-quarters combat. Kenneth's preparation extended beyond physical modifications. He began altering his routine to create the appearance of vulnerability while actually strengthening his defensive position. He started taking his evening walks at precisely 9 p.m., during which he would actually position himself in overwatch positions around the neighborhood. His early bedtime routine actually involved positioning himself in the basement armory, monitoring the surveillance feeds he'd installed throughout the house. The psychological preparation was equally important. Kenneth spent hours in meditation, centering himself for what was coming. He'd killed before, but always under orders, always with the moral clarity of serving his country. This would be different, personal, intimate, and entirely outside the legal structure that had previously governed his actions. Kenneth also began making subtle changes to his legal and financial situation. He created new bank accounts under identity protocols he'd learned in covert operations, established safe deposit boxes with emergency funds and documentation, and prepared multiple exit strategies in case the operation went wrong. Everything had to be ready for a rapid disappearance if necessary. The most crucial preparation involved manipulating Angela and Stephen's timeline. Through careful psychological pressure, mentioning home security concerns, discussing neighborhood crime, expressing worry about working late alone, Kenneth encouraged them to accelerate their plans. He needed them to act while he was ready, not when they chose. The breakthrough came when Kenneth intercepted a communication between Pierce's team and Stephen. They'd set the date, Halloween night. The symbolism wasn't lost on Kenneth. They planned to make his death part of the season's horror. What they didn't realize was that they'd chosen to attack a man who'd become very comfortable with darkness. Kenneth spent the final week before Halloween in intensive preparation. He cleaned and tested every weapon in his arsenal, memorized the tactical layout of his modified home, and ran through combat scenarios until his responses became automatic. He also made peace with what he was about to become. No longer a soldier following orders, but a man dispensing justice according to his own code. 3 days before Halloween, Kenneth made his final preparations. He arranged for a business trip that would give him an alibi for being away during the attack, except he wouldn't actually leave town. Instead, he'd be waiting in his basement command center, ready to spring the trap he'd spent months preparing. On Halloween morning, Kenneth kissed Angela goodbye for what he knew would be the last time. She responded with the same casual affection she'd been showing him for months, completely unaware that her husband had discovered her plans and prepared a counter-operation that would end with her death. Kenneth spent that final day at the shop, maintaining his routine while internally running through the tactical checklist one last time. Everything was ready. weapons positioned, surveillance operational, escape routes prepared, and contingency plans in place for every possible scenario. As evening approached, Kenneth closed the shop and drove home, knowing that before dawn, Fermin would be dead, and his marriage would end in blood. He felt no emotion about what was coming, only the cold certainty of a professional completing a mission. The mechanic's mask would come off tonight, and Pine Ridge would discover what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening a man who'd earned his reputation in the world's most dangerous places. Halloween was about to become very real for the people who thought Kenneth Bauer was just another mark to be eliminated. Chapter 4. The Watchers Watched. October 30th passed in a haze of false normalcy. Kenneth went through his usual routine at the shop, but every action was performed with the hyper-awareness of a soldier preparing for battle. He could feel Pierce's team conducting surveillance, their presence like static electricity in the air around his neighborhood. Kenneth had identified their observation posts through his own counter-surveillance operations. A panel van parked 3 blocks away with rotating occupants, a construction worker who'd been reading the same newspaper for 3 days, and a jogger whose route always included passing Kenneth's house during shift changes. They were professionals, but Kenneth had spent years hunting professionals in environments where detection meant death. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Pierce's team watched Kenneth, Kenneth was watching them. His own surveillance network had cataloged their routines, identified their communication patterns, and mapped their operational procedures. They thought they were the hunters, but Kenneth had flipped the script without them realizing it. Angela's behavior reached new levels of deception during these final hours. She made elaborate plans for Halloween night, a girls' night out with colleagues from her real estate office. The lie was carefully constructed with multiple witnesses and a paper trail, designed to give her an airtight alibi for Kenneth's planned murder. She even bought new clothes for the occasion, playing the part of the excited wife looking forward to a rare night away from home. Stephen's involvement became more obvious as the deadline approached. He called the house multiple times, ostensibly to discuss property listings with Angela, but Kenneth's audio surveillance revealed the coded language they used to coordinate the final details. Time confirmations disguised as appointment scheduling, escape route discussions masked as driving directions, and payment confirmations hidden in conversations about commission structures. Kenneth's final day of preparation involved a delicate psychological operation designed to ensure Angela and Stephen would proceed as planned. He expressed concern about recent break-ins in neighboring areas, mentioned his planned early bedtime due to feeling under the weather, and even suggested that Angela should definitely go out with her friend to take her mind off his security paranoia. Each suggestion was calculated to reinforce their existing plan while appearing to come from Kenneth's own anxiety. Angela responded perfectly, offering to cancel her evening to keep him company, while secretly relieved that he was practically giving her permission to be elsewhere during his assassination. The afternoon brought a crucial piece of intelligence when Kenneth intercepted a final communication between Pierce and Stephen. The attack was confirmed for 11 p.m., after Kenneth's usual bedtime, but early enough to catch him in his most vulnerable state. Pierce's team would breach through the back door while Kenneth slept, eliminate him quickly, and stage a burglary scene before disappearing into the night. What they didn't know was that Kenneth's bedroom would be empty and their target would be positioned in the basement with full surveillance coverage of their operation. The hunters would become the hunted the moment they crossed his threshold. Kenneth spent the evening creating the perfect illusion of normal domestic life. He cooked dinner for Angela, watched television with her on the couch, and even helped her choose jewelry for her night out. To any observer, including Pierce's surveillance team, it looked like a typical suburban evening before the wife left for her social engagement. At 9 p.m., Angela kissed Kenneth goodbye with what he recognized as relief rather than affection. She was eager to establish her alibi, unaware that she was also removing herself from the battlefield her husband had prepared. Kenneth watched her drive away, knowing she was heading to Stephen's apartment to wait while her husband was murdered. Kenneth's transformation began the moment Angela's car turned the corner. The suburban husband disappeared, replaced by the tactical operator who'd earned his reputation in the mountains of Afghanistan. He killed all the lights in the house, activated his surveillance system, and descended to the basement command center where his weapons waited. The final hour before the attack passed in focused preparation. Kenneth donned dark tactical clothing, checked his equipment one last time, and positioned himself where he could monitor all approaches to the house. The waiting was familiar. He'd done it countless times in hostile territory, watching for enemies who thought they were the only predators in the darkness. At 10:47 p.m., Kenneth's perimeter sensors detected movement in the backyard. Four thermal signatures approached the house with military precision, using hand signals and coordinated movement patterns that marked them as professionals. They'd studied the house layout, identified entry points, and were executing their mission with the confidence of men who'd done this many times before. What Pierce's team couldn't see was the infrared grid Kenneth had established throughout his property, or the kill zones he prepared inside the house, or the weapons positioned at strategic points along their planned route. They were walking into a trap designed by someone who understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Kenneth watched through his surveillance feeds as Pierce's team reached the back door. They used professional entry tools, worked with practice silence, and communicated through the kind of tactical sign language Kenneth recognized from his own military service. They were good at what they did, but they'd made one fatal error. They'd chosen to attack a man who was better. The lock clicked open at 10:58 p.m. Pierce's team paused, listening for any sign their entry had been detected. Hearing nothing, they began their infiltration, moving through Kenneth's house like shadows. What they didn't realize was that they were being watched by someone who'd become very comfortable operating in the darkness. Kenneth's pulse remained steady as the four men spread through his house, heading toward the bedroom where they expected to find their sleeping target. The next few minutes would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient, whether a suburban mechanic could successfully transition back to being a lethal operator, and whether justice would be served to people who thought they could commit murder without consequences. The war Kenneth had been preparing for was about to begin, and only one side knew the battle had already started. Chapter 5. Blood in the Darkness. The four men moved through Kenneth's house with lethal precision, their night vision equipment turning the darkened rooms into a green-tinted tactical environment. Pierce led the team, his decades of covert operations experience evident in every calculated step. What he and his men couldn't see were the modifications Kenneth had made, the reinforced door frames that channeled movement, the hidden mirrors that provided sightlines, and the weapons caches positioned throughout the house. Kenneth watched from his basement command center as the team split into their predetermined formation. Two men headed toward the master bedroom, where they expected to find their target, while Pierce and the fourth operative covered the exits. It was textbook close-quarters combat methodology, executed by professionals who'd done this type of work many times before. The team's communication discipline was excellent. Hand signals only, no verbal contact that might wake their intended victim. They'd studied Kenneth's routine and knew he was a heavy sleeper who went to bed early. What they didn't know was that their target had been watching them watch him for weeks, and that every assumption they'd made about his capabilities was fatally wrong. Kenneth's counter-operation began when the first two men reached the master bedroom. Using his surveillance feeds, he tracked their exact positions as they prepared to breach the door. The lead operative had his suppressed pistol ready, while his partner positioned himself to secure the room after the elimination. They were seconds away from discovering that their target wasn't in bed. Kenneth emerged from the basement through a concealed entrance he'd built into the kitchen pantry, moving with the silence that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. His first target was the operative covering the back exit, the man positioned where Pierce thought Kenneth might try to escape if the assassination went wrong. The knife entered between the man's ribs before he even sensed Kenneth's presence, finding the heart with surgical precision. Kenneth caught the body as it fell, easing it to the floor without making a sound. 1 down, 3 to go, and the enemy still thought they were in control of the situation. Kenneth's second target was the operative positioned near the front door. This one required more finesse. The man was alert and positioned where the others could see him if he disappeared suddenly. Kenneth used a technique he'd perfected in Afghanistan, approaching from an angle that placed furniture between the target and his team members. The attack came from behind, Kenneth's hands finding the man's neck and applying pressure to the carotid arteries. It took exactly 12 seconds for the operative to lose consciousness, and another 8 for his neck to snap with a quiet pop that wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area. 2 down, and Pierce's team still hadn't realized they were under attack. The remaining 2 men were in the master bedroom, having just discovered that their target wasn't where he was supposed to be. Kenneth heard one of them hiss a quiet curse as they realized something was wrong. Pierce's voice came through their tactical radios, barely audible, but picked up by Kenneth's surveillance system. Target's not in bed. Check the house. Kenneth smiled grimly as he heard those words. Pierce was about to learn the difference between hunting a civilian and hunting someone who'd been trained to hunt them. Kenneth positioned himself in the hallway between the bedroom and the living areas, using shadows and the architectural modifications he'd made to remain invisible. When Pierce emerged from the bedroom, weapon ready and senses alert, Kenneth was waiting above him on a ledge he'd built into the ceiling space. Kenneth dropped onto Pierce's partner first, driving the man to the floor with crushing force. The impact stunned the operative, giving Kenneth time to snap his neck before he could cry out. The sound of the body hitting the floor alerted Pierce, but by then it was too late to save his team member. Pierce spun toward the sound, his weapon tracking through the darkness, but Kenneth had already moved. Years of close-quarters combat experience allowed Kenneth to anticipate Pierce's reaction, positioning himself where the team leader would be most vulnerable. The final confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Pierce was skilled, experienced, and desperate, but Kenneth fought with the cold precision of someone defending his home against intruders who'd come to murder him. Pierce's suppressed pistol fired twice, the bullets embedding in walls where Kenneth had been moments before. Kenneth's response was more direct and final. Pierce's neck broke with the same quiet efficiency Kenneth had used on his teammates. 4 professional killers laid dead in Kenneth's house, their mission incomplete and their employer about to face consequences they hadn't anticipated. Kenneth stood in his darkened living room, breathing slowly and deeply as his pulse returned to normal. The mechanical precision of the kills, the tactical awareness that had kept him alive, the cold calculation that had eliminated threats, it all felt familiar. He hadn't lost any of his edge during his civilian years. He'd simply been waiting for a reason to use it again. Kenneth checked his watch, 11:23 p.m. The entire operation had taken less than 25 minutes from breach to completion. Now came the next phase, the one Pierce and his team had never considered because they'd assumed Kenneth would be dead. Kenneth retrieved one of the dead operative's phones and scrolled through the contact list until he found the entry he was looking for, client. He composed a text message that would have been sent by Pierce if everything had gone according to plan. Package delivered. Clean exit completed. Wire transfer requested. Kenneth sent the message and waited for the response. It came within minutes, and the number was exactly what Kenneth had expected, Stephen Hathaway's personal cell phone. The confirmation Kenneth needed to proceed with the next phase of his operation. Kenneth's phone rang as he was positioning the bodies. Angela's name appeared on the caller ID, and Kenneth answered with the voice of a man who'd been awakened by an unusual sound. Kenneth? I heard something on the neighborhood app about activity in our area. Are you okay? Kenneth almost admired the performance. Angela was establishing her concern for her husband's welfare while actually checking to confirm his death. The caring wife act was perfectly executed, with just the right note of worry in her voice. I'm fine, honey. Thought I heard something outside, but it was probably just the wind. Are you having fun with the girls? Oh yes, we're having a great time. I'll probably stay at Cindy's tonight rather than drive home late. You don't mind, do you? Of course not. Sleep well. Kenneth ended the call knowing it would be the last conversation he'd ever have with his wife. Kenneth spent the next hour methodically erasing all evidence of his involvement in the evening's events. The bodies were staged to look like they'd been killed by each other during a home invasion gone wrong. The kind of criminal-on-criminal violence that would confuse investigators and provide no leads back to Kenneth. By 1 a.m., Kenneth had transformed his house back into a normal suburban home with no trace of the military operation that had just concluded. The 4 dead operatives looked like burglars who'd killed each other in a dispute over tactics, and Kenneth looked like a homeowner who'd slept through the entire incident. Kenneth poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in his kitchen, thinking about the text message he'd sent from Pierce's phone. Stephen and Angela were about to discover that their perfect murder plan had one fatal flaw. They'd chosen the wrong victim. Chapter 6. The Final Call. Kenneth waited in his kitchen until 2:30 a.m. before making his next move. He needed Angela and Stephen to believe their plan had succeeded long enough for them to incriminate themselves further. The text he'd sent from Pierce's phone would have convinced them that Kenneth was dead, setting up the final phase of his operation. Kenneth's phone rang at exactly 2:45 a.m. The caller ID showed Angela's number, but Kenneth let it go to voicemail. He needed to hear what she would say when she thought he couldn't answer, when she believed she was leaving a message for a dead man's phone. Angela's voice on the recording was perfect: panic, confusion, and fear that sounded genuine enough to fool investigators. Kenneth? Kenneth, are you there? I got a call from the alarm company saying there was activity at the house. I'm coming home right now. Please call me back. The performance was flawless, designed to create a timeline where Angela appeared to have received notification of the break-in and rushed home to check on her husband. It would have worked if Kenneth had actually been dead. Instead, it provided him with exactly the opportunity he needed. Kenneth activated the surveillance system he'd installed in Angela's car months earlier. The GPS tracker showed her leaving Stephen's downtown apartment at 2:47 a.m., right on schedule. Audio from the car's interior revealed Angela's true state of mind. It's done, she said into her phone. Kenneth's phone isn't answering, which means Pierce finished the job. I'm heading to the house now to discover the body and call 911. Remember, we never spoke tonight. Stephen's voice came through the car speakers. Are you sure you can handle seeing him like that? Pierce said it would be messy. I've been planning this for months, Stephen. I can handle a few minutes of acting traumatized before the police arrive. By this time tomorrow, I'll be a widow and Kenneth's assets will be mine. Kenneth turned off the recording and prepared for Angela's arrival. She expected to find her husband's body surrounded by evidence of a home invasion. Instead, she would find something much worse: a husband who knew exactly what she'd done. Kenneth positioned himself in the living room where Angela would see him immediately upon entering. The 4 dead operatives had been removed through his basement exit and disposed of in locations where they'd eventually be found, but with no connection to Kenneth's house. Instead, Kenneth had created a different scene entirely. When Angela's headlights swept across the front windows at 3:15 a.m., Kenneth was sitting calmly in his favorite chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and Pierce's phone on the coffee table beside him. The house lights were on. Everything looked normal, and Kenneth appeared to be very much alive. Angela's key turned in the front door, and Kenneth heard her practiced intake of breath as she prepared to discover her husband's body. Instead, she found Kenneth watching her with eyes that held no trace of the trusting husband she'd been deceiving. Hello, Angela. You're home earlier than expected. Angela's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, fear, and then a desperate attempt to maintain her cover story. Kenneth, thank God you're okay. I got a call from the alarm company about a break-in. Are you hurt? What happened? Kenneth held up Pierce's phone. I got a very interesting text message tonight from your friend Stephen. Something about a package being delivered and payment being due. Angela's face went white as she recognized the device. Kenneth could see her mind racing, trying to find an explanation that would maintain her innocence. But there was no innocent explanation for why her husband had Pierce's phone, and they both knew it. I don't know what you're talking about, Angela said, but her voice carried the tremor of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing. Kenneth stood up slowly, moving with a controlled precision that Angela had never seen before. 4 men came to kill me tonight, Angela. Professional killers hired by you and Stephen to eliminate your inconvenient husband. They expected to find a trusting mechanic who'd never suspect his wife's betrayal. Kenneth, you're scaring me. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. They found something else instead, Kenneth continued, ignoring her protests. They found someone who'd spent 3 tours in Afghanistan hunting men exactly like them. Someone who knew they were coming because he'd been watching his faithless wife plan his murder. Angela backed toward the door, finally understanding that her husband wasn't the man she'd thought he was. Kenneth, please, Let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Kenneth's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You hired killers to murder your husband for money. In most places, that's called a capital crime. Angela's phone rang, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The caller ID showed Stephen's name, and Kenneth gestured for her to answer it. Go ahead. Your partner is probably wondering why you haven't called to confirm that I'm dead. Angela answered with shaking hands. Stephen's voice was audible in the quiet room. Did everything go as planned? Did you find the body? Angela looked at Kenneth's impassive face and made her final choice. Instead of confessing, instead of begging for mercy, she decided to continue the deception that had already cost 4 men their lives. Yes, she whispered into the phone. It's done. Kenneth's dead. Kenneth smiled, a cold expression that Angela had never seen before. Thank you for that. Stephen should be here shortly to help you stage your grief, shouldn't he? After all, you'll need witnesses to your discovery of your husband's body. Angela's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair. The elaborate plan she'd spent months perfecting had become her own trap, and the husband she'd thought was weak and trusting had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. How long have you known? She asked, abandoning any pretense of innocence. Long enough to prepare for tonight. Long enough to understand that you weren't just planning to leave me, Angela. You were planning to have me killed. That changes the rules of engagement considerably. Kenneth walked to the window and looked out at the street. Stephen should be arriving soon. He'll want to coordinate your stories before you call the police to report finding my body. Except there won't be any need for police reports because Stephen won't be making the return trip home. Angela started to speak, but Kenneth held up a hand for silence. A car was pulling into their driveway, Stephen's black Mercedes, arriving right on schedule to help Angela through her traumatic discovery. Kenneth checked his watch. 3:45 a.m. Time to finish what Angela and Stephen had started, but with an ending they hadn't planned for. Here's what's going to happen, Angela. Stephen is going to come through that door expecting to help you stage a crime scene. Instead, he's going to find out what happens when someone threatens the wrong person's life. Angela started to stand, perhaps thinking she could warn Stephen or run to his protection. Kenneth's voice stopped her cold. If you move from that chair, if you make any sound to warn him, I'll make sure your death takes considerably longer than his will. Do you understand me? Angela nodded, tears streaming down her face as she finally comprehended the type of man she'd been living with, the type of man she'd tried to have murdered. Stephen's footsteps approached the front door, and Kenneth positioned himself where he'd have the tactical advantage. The mechanic who'd been marked for death was gone, replaced by the operator who'd earned his reputation in the world's deadliest places. The final act of Angela and Stephen's plan was about to begin, but the ending would be written by someone who understood that betrayal carried a price that had to be paid in full. Chapter 7. Justice Without Mercy. Stephen entered the house with the confident stride of a man who believed his carefully orchestrated plan had succeeded. He expected to find Angela playing the role of traumatized widow, perhaps crying over Kenneth's body while they prepared their story for the police. Instead, he found his lover sitting frozen in a chair while her very much alive husband stood watching him with predatory stillness. Angela, what's... Stephen began, then stopped as his eyes met Kenneth's. The lawyer's practiced composure cracked as he processed the impossible scene before him. Stephen Hathaway, Kenneth said calmly. You're earlier than I expected, but punctuality has always been important in business transactions. Please come in. We need to discuss the status of your contract. Stephen's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Kenneth's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't recommend reaching for whatever you're carrying. The men you hired to kill me learned the hard way that I'm not the easy target you thought I was. Kenneth, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Stephen started, falling back on the attorney's instinct to negotiate his way out of dangerous situations. No misunderstanding at all. My wife hired Pierce and his team to murder me tonight. When that failed, you came here to help Angela stage the discovery of my body. The only miscalculation in your plan was assuming that a small-town mechanic would be defenseless against professional killers. Kenneth moved to the coffee table and picked up Pierce's phone, holding it where Stephen could see it. Pierce won't be completing his contract. Neither will his 3 associates. They made the mistake of breaking into the home of someone who spent years eliminating threats in much more challenging environments. Stephen's face went ashen as he understood the implications. Where are they? Scattered across various locations where they'll eventually be found. The local police will conclude they died in conflicts with other criminals, occupational hazards in their line of work. No trail leading back to you or Angela, which was very considerate of me. Angela found her voice, desperation making her bold. Stephen, he's lost his mind. He's talking about killing people. We need to call the police. Kenneth's laugh was devoid of humor. By all means, call them. Explain how you hired assassins to murder your husband, then came here to help stage the discovery of his body. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic to your situation. Stephen's attorney training kicked in, analyzing the situation for possible escape routes. Even if what you're saying is true, you can't prove we were involved. It's your word against ours. Kenneth pulled out his phone and played a recording of Angela's car conversation with Stephen. Their voices filled the room, discussing Kenneth's death with casual satisfaction, making plans for their new life together, and confirming the payment to Pierce's team. Digital surveillance has come a long way since your last murder, Stephen. I have recordings of every conversation, documentation of every meeting, and a complete timeline of your conspiracy. The only question now is how this story ends. Stephen tried a different approach, the desperate negotiation of a man who realized his life was in immediate danger. Look, Kenneth, we can work something out. If you know about the offshore accounts, you know there's more than enough money for everyone. We can make a deal. The same kind of deal you made with your previous marks? The ones who ended up committing suicide after you cleaned out their assets? I've done my research on you, Stephen. This isn't your first time orchestrating a spouse's murder. Kenneth's words hit Stephen like physical blows. The lawyer's face revealed his understanding that Kenneth knew everything, not just about the current conspiracy, but about Stephen's entire operation. Those were different circumstances, Stephen said weakly. Mental health issues, depression after the divorces, executions disguised as suicides. Very creative, very profitable, and completely undetectable until someone with the right background decided to investigate. Your mistake was choosing a target who knew how to hunt predators. Angela was sobbing now, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her denial. Kenneth, please. I'm sorry. I was confused. I made terrible choices, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can. You hired men to murder me in my sleep, Angela. You plan to inherit my assets and disappear with your lover. Counseling isn't going to address that level of betrayal. Kenneth's phone buzzed with a text message. He checked it and smiled, an expression that made both Angela and Stephen flinch. That was confirmation from an old military contact. Pierce's team has been connected to several unsolved murders across 3 states. When their bodies are found, investigators will assume they were eliminated by rival criminals. Very convenient for everyone involved. Stephen made a desperate play, lunging toward the front door in a bid for escape. Kenneth moved with liquid speed, intercepting Stephen before he'd taken 3 steps. The impact drove Stephen to the floor, and Kenneth's knee found pressure points that left the lawyer gasping and helpless. That was poorly thought out, Stephen. You're a soft man who spent his life manipulating others to do his violence for him. Running wasn't a realistic option. Kenneth hauled Stephen upright and positioned him next to Angela. Both conspirators sat facing their intended victim, understanding that they'd miscalculated in the most fatal way possible. Here's what's going to happen, Kenneth said, his voice carrying the finality of a military briefing. You're both going to pay for trying to have me murdered. Not through the legal system you've both learned to manipulate, but through a more direct form of justice. You can't just murder U.S., Stephen protested. You're not a killer. Kenneth's response was quiet and absolutely certain. I've killed more people than you can imagine, Stephen. The only difference is that now I'm doing it for personal reasons rather than national security. The mechanics remain the same. Angela looked at her husband with growing horror, finally seeing the man she'd actually married instead of the facade he'd maintained during their civilian life together. What are you going to do to us? Kenneth checked his watch again. 4:15 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, giving him time to complete his operation before the neighborhood started stirring. You planned my death very carefully, with attention to every detail that would protect you from consequences. I'm going to show you the same consideration by ensuring your disappearance is equally thorough. Kenneth's basement workshop contained everything he needed for the final phase of his operation. Angela and Stephen were about to discover that betraying a man with his background carried consequences they'd never imagined, and that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't tried to have him murdered. The mechanic was gone completely now, replaced by someone who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood. Chapter 8. The Cleaner's Art. Kenneth's basement workshop transformed into an interrogation facility with military efficiency. Within 30 minutes, he'd secured both Angela and Stephen to chairs position where they could see each other but couldn't communicate effectively. The setup was designed for psychological pressure as much as physical restraint. Each conspirator would watch the other face consequences for their shared betrayal. I'm going to ask you some questions, Kenneth explained with the clinical detachment of a professional extracting intelligence. Your answers will determine how long this process takes, but they won't change the eventual outcome. You both try to have me murdered, and that debt has to be paid in full. Angela tried to maintain some vestige of the innocent victim role she'd perfected. Kenneth, I know you're hurt and angry, but this isn't who you are. You're a good man who wouldn't hurt his wife. You're right that this isn't who I was, Kenneth replied. The man you married was playing a role, just like you were. The difference is that my role was concealing someone much more dangerous than the person you were hiding. Kenneth pulled out a tablet displaying financial records he'd compiled during his investigation. Let's start with the money, Stephen. Your offshore accounts show payments from at least 6 different suicide victims over the past 4 years. How many people have you murdered for their assets? Stephen's training as an attorney kicked in automatically. I'm not answering any questions without legal representation present. Kenneth's response was swift and educational. Pressure applied to specific nerve clusters left Stephen gasping and reconsidering his position on legal representation. This isn't a courtroom, Stephen. You're not entitled to an attorney, a phone call, or any of the constitutional protections you've spent your career manipulating. You're in the basement of a man you try to have killed, and your survival depends entirely on my mood. Angela watched Stephen's pain with growing terror, finally understanding that her husband possessed capabilities she'd never suspected. Kenneth, please, whatever you think we did, there has to be another explanation. The explanation is simple, Angela. You wanted my money and my death, so you hired professionals to murder me. When that failed, you and Stephen came here to stage the crime scene. Everything else is just details. Kenneth displayed photographs from his surveillance operations, images of Angela and Stephen's meetings, their romantic encounters, their conferences with Pierce's team. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably damning. These photos will be found in Stephen's apartment after his disappearance, along with financial records linking him to multiple murders. The story will be that Stephen realized his operation was unraveling and eliminated his accomplices before fleeing the country. Stephen's composure finally cracked completely. You can't make this disappear. People know we were together tonight. Angela's friends, the restaurant staff, security cameras, all of which will support the official narrative. Angela left her girls' night early because she was upset about her relationship with Stephen. She came home to confront me about the affair. We argued, and she stormed out. Very dramatic, very believable, and completely consistent with the evidence I prepared. Kenneth's planning had been exhaustive. Angela's car would be found abandoned near the airport, suggesting she'd fled after Stephen's disappearance. Her phone records would show increasingly frantic attempts to contact Stephen, painting her as a panicked accomplice rather than a calculating conspirator. The beauty of it, Kenneth continued, is that you've both been so careful to hide your relationship that no one will think to connect your disappearances until it's too late. Stephen's history of murdering spouses for money will dominate the investigation. Angela's denial finally collapsed into desperate bargaining. We could give you everything back. The offshore accounts, the stolen money, all of it. Just let us disappear and you'll never see us again. The money was never the real issue, Angela. You could have divorced me and taken half of everything legally. Instead, you chose to have me murdered because you wanted it all and you thought I was too weak to stop you. Kenneth's methodical extraction of information continued for another hour. By the end, he had complete details of Stephen's entire operation, the names of his other victims, the locations of hidden assets, and the methods he'd used to avoid detection. Angela provided additional intelligence about their plans for Kenneth's assets and their intended escape route. One final question, Kenneth said as dawn began filtering through the basement windows. Do either of you want to confess to the families of Stephen's previous victims? Give them closure about what really happened to their loved ones. Both conspirators remained silent, confirming Kenneth's assessment that they were beyond redemption. Kenneth's execution of justice was swift and professional. Stephen died first, never knowing exactly when the final moment came. Angela's end took longer, not from cruelty, but because Kenneth wanted her to understand completely what betrayal had cost her. The cleanup took the rest of the morning. Kenneth's military training included body disposal techniques perfected in environments where evidence couldn't be left behind. Both Angela and Stephen would eventually be found, but in locations and conditions that supported the narrative Kenneth had constructed. By noon, Kenneth had sanitized his basement workshop and restored his house to normal suburban appearance. Angela's abandoned car was positioned near the airport, her phone programmed to send confused messages to Stephen's number at intervals that suggested growing panic. Stephen's apartment contained evidence linking him to multiple murders, financial fraud, and a hasty escape from the country. Kenneth returned to his auto shop and resumed his normal routine, the mechanic's mask firmly back in place. To anyone watching, he was just another small-town businessman dealing with the stress of his wife's apparent affair and subsequent disappearance. The investigation would unfold exactly as Kenneth had planned. Stephen would be identified as a serial killer who preyed on wealthy spouses. Angela would be seen as his final victim, and Kenneth would be viewed as the betrayed husband who'd lost everything to a sophisticated criminal. What no one would ever discover was that the mechanic who'd been marked for death had been someone else entirely. Someone who understood that justice sometimes required stepping outside the law, and that betrayal carried a price that had to be paid in full. Kenneth had eliminated every threat to his life and freedom, but the cost had been his faith in human nature and his ability to trust another person completely. Some victories left scars that never healed, and some justice came with a price that lasted forever. Chapter 9. After the Storm. 6 months after Angela's disappearance, Kenneth Bauer had become Pine Ridge's most sympathetic figure. The community rallied around the betrayed husband whose wife had been seduced by a serial killer and vanished without a trace. Local news coverage portrayed Kenneth as the devastated victim of Stephen Hathaway's sophisticated criminal operation, which had claimed victims across multiple states before finally unraveling. The FBI investigation concluded exactly as Kenneth had orchestrated. Stephen Hathaway was identified as the mastermind behind at least 7 murders disguised as suicides, with Angela Hansenbauer listed as his final victim. Evidence found in Stephen's apartment painted a picture of a man whose killing spree had spiraled out of control before he fled the country with his latest conquest. Kenneth played his role perfectly during the investigation. He provided investigators with the evidence he'd discovered of Angela's affair, expressed bewildered grief over her betrayal and disappearance, and cooperated fully with law enforcement efforts to trace Stephen's criminal network. To everyone watching, he was simply a heartbroken mechanic trying to rebuild his life after losing everything to forces beyond his control. The insurance payouts provided Kenneth with substantial assets: Angela's life insurance policy, compensation for Stephen's theft of marital property, even victim assistance funds for surviving family members of serial killers. The money meant nothing to Kenneth, but it provided the resources for his next chapter. Kenneth sold Bauer's auto repair to a young mechanic who'd been working for him part-time. The sale was structured to provide the new owner with favorable terms while giving Kenneth a clean break from his old life. He donated most of Angela's possessions to charity, keeping only items that serve as long-term plans. The house on Maple Street went on the market 3 months after Angela's disappearance. Kenneth told neighbors he couldn't bear living in a place with so many painful memories, which earned him additional sympathy while providing cover for his actual reasons for leaving. The basement workshop was carefully sanitized before the sale, all evidence of its true purpose removed without a trace. Kenneth's new home was a remote cabin in Montana, purchased through shell companies that couldn't be traced back to him. The property sat on 40 acres of wilderness, providing the isolation and security he needed for his actual retirement plans. To his Pine Ridge neighbors, he'd moved away to heal from his trauma. In reality, he'd simply relocated to a more suitable environment for his true nature. The cabin's basement contained a workshop that would have been familiar to Kenneth's military colleagues, weapons storage, communication equipment, and surveillance technology that kept him connected to events across the country. Kenneth hadn't retired from his war. He'd simply changed its scope and methodology. Kenneth's new identity was that of a trauma counselor specializing in helping victims of domestic violence and criminal conspiracies. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become an expert in helping people deal with exactly the kind of betrayal he'd eliminated from his own life. His clients found him remarkably insightful about the psychology of predators and the importance of permanent solutions to recurring threats. Some of Kenneth's counseling work was legitimate, helping genuine victims rebuild their lives and develop protective strategies. But some of his clients presented situations that reminded Kenneth of his own experience with Angela and Stephen. These cases required a different kind of intervention, one that drew on Kenneth's specialized skills rather than conventional therapy techniques. A year after Pine Ridge, Kenneth received a visit from a woman whose husband had hired killers to eliminate her after draining their assets. The local police had been compromised, the FBI investigation had stalled, and she was living under assumed identities while professional assassins hunted her. Kenneth listened to her story with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was facing. When she finished, he made a phone call to contacts who specialized in making dangerous people disappear permanently. Within a week, the woman's problems had been resolved with the same thoroughness Kenneth had applied to his own situation. Word of Kenneth's unique counseling success spread through networks that existed outside conventional law enforcement channels. Victims who'd exhausted legal options began finding their way to his Montana retreat, bringing situations that required Kenneth's particular expertise. Each case was evaluated carefully, and solutions were implemented with the precision that had made Kenneth legendary in certain military circles. Kenneth never advertised his services or actively recruited clients. People found him through referrals from previous clients or through connections in the underground networks that helped victims when the system failed them. His reputation grew slowly but consistently. The counselor who helped people when no one else could, who understood that some problems required permanent solutions. The mechanic's mask was gone forever, replaced by the persona of a trauma specialist who'd suffered his own devastating losses. Kenneth's clients saw him as someone who understood their pain because he'd experienced similar betrayal. What they didn't realize was that his understanding came from being the solution to the problem rather than its victim. Kenneth's Montana cabin included a small cemetery in the woods behind the house. Unmarked graves containing the remains of people who'd made the mistake of threatening his client's safety. Each burial represented a case where rehabilitation had been impossible and elimination had been necessary. Kenneth maintained the cemetery with the same attention to detail he'd applied to his military operations. 5 years after Pine Ridge, Kenneth had become something unique in American criminal justice. A one-man court of last resort for victims who couldn't find justice through conventional means. His success rate was perfect, his methods were untraceable, and his clients' problems stayed solved permanently. Kenneth never remarried, never formed close personal relationships, and never again made the mistake of trusting someone completely. He'd learned that betrayal was a fundamental risk of human connection, and he'd chosen to minimize that risk by maintaining emotional distance from everyone in his life. The war that had begun in his suburban home had evolved into something larger and more purposeful. Kenneth had become judge, jury, and executioner for people who preyed on the innocent, using skills learned in service to his country to provide justice for victims the system couldn't protect. In quiet moments, Kenneth sometimes thought about the husband he'd been before Angela's betrayal. Trusting, optimistic, believing in the possibility of lasting love. That man had died in the basement workshop on Maple Street, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous to the predators who thought they could hurt innocent people without consequences. Kenneth